Reyes with Worldwide Beerfest. I'm here with Val Allen, head brewer at Anderson Valley Brewing Company in Boonville, California.
How you doing?
Doing great, Val. How are you?
Pretty good.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to chat with you. I just wanted to get started and talk about how you got started in the brewing industry.
I was bartending in Seattle when I lived up there at a place called Reyes Boathouse, and I was checking in an order one day, and I was a home brewer at the time, and I don't know, made probably 10 or so batches with some success. And I was checking in an order, and there was Red Hook beer in the order, and I thought, someone gets paid money to make Red Hook. I wonder if I could get paid money to make Red Hook. And the answer was not so much money, that is, but I did go down and pester the brewer and take him some of my homebrew, for the next few weeks. And eventually he said, okay, fine, I'll hire you, but don't bring any more of your homebrew in. So that was my first professional brewing job. And the brewer was named Rick Buchanan, nice guy, and a real character. But he kind of realized that I was interested in the process and took a shine to me and moved me around to the different stations, keg washing, keg filling, filtration, cellaring, and so I got a pretty good education there in the first couple of years.
What kind of beers was Red Hook brewing back then?
They made some unusual beers. Most of them were English style. Their first beer was a kind of a British pale ale, but it had some very weird characteristics. I think Michael Jackson kindly described it as Belgian-esque. But they would do things like stop the fermentation early so that they'd have enough diacetyl in the beer because they liked that flavor. I know, very weird, right? So that was their main seller, and then they came out with a bitter called Ballard Bitter, which wasn't so diacetyl-y, and they also had a porter. So they had this kind of weird ale, the Ballard Bitter and the porter. Those were the three beers they made back then, and 2 out of 3 was pretty good. And I was there for just over a year and a half. But brewing really didn't pay very much back then. So I had to keep my night job tending bar. And that eventually got to be a bit much, working 4 or 5 days a week or nights a week, and then 3 or 4 days a week. So the brewing stuff was only when they needed us. So we'd be in on brew days or, packaging days or whatever, but it wasn't full time. So neither of them were completely full time, but I'd often do back to back, get there at 8 in the morning, then go from there to the next job and get home at 2 in the morning. So that didn't last long.
It sounds like you probably had an opportunity to hone your palate and try a lot of beers.
Yeah, I did. And, I was young, so those kinds of hours were more acceptable. But yeah, it was a good experience. And then at some point I quit and was just kind of doing nothing. And my mother, of all people, saw a posting on a university job board at UW that said, brewer wanted. So I went down and applied at this place, and it was Pike Place Brewing, which was a tiny little brewery down underneath the Pike Place Market. And I worked there for quite a few years.
And I remember Pike, that was one of the first craft beers that I really enjoyed, was the Kilt Lifter. I could drink that beer every day. What kind of beers were you brewing at Pike Brewery when you got started?
When I first started there, they were making a pale ale and a stout, something light, something dark. And that, most breweries in America were making something light, something dark, and if you were lucky, a wheat beer. And they were mostly English style beers because those were a 2-week, fermentation rotation, as opposed to lagers, which can take, 12 or 15 or more weeks. So they were much quicker to produce. So that's what people were making. And their pale ale was pretty good. you know, and their stout was really, really good. And the recipes were developed by a guy named Vince Catone, and the yeast was harvested by Vince, supposedly on a trip to Fuller's Brewing. He scooped it out of one of their fermenters when no one was looking.
Wow, that's pretty bold.
Well, there weren't yeast banks back then. This is, back in the mid 80s. So I started with Pike, I think, in 89 or 90. And so it was quite a ways back. I think it was 89. And there weren't yeast suppliers. Malt suppliers would barely deal with us. The hop suppliers didn't want to deal with us. We were all way too small. Even the biggest craft brewers weren't that big. And there were only, less than 100 of them in the nation. So now there's 10,000. So that's a big change. So it was different times, certainly. There weren't a lot of ways to get yeast back then. I'm not even sure that Dave Logston's place, Y Yeast, was even in business yet. And I'm pretty sure White Labs wasn't. So you had to find your yeast where you could. And some brewers were really good and they'd give you some, because, when you brew beer, you pitch the yeast and it multiplies and you make way more than you need in a batch of beer. So you only save part of it for the next batch. So if the brewers were kind, they'd be willing to share. Otherwise, you had to get dried yeast. And back then, dried yeast was really poor quality. Nowadays, the dried yeast is much better quality and you can make really good beer with it. But back then, it wasn't the case. And even then, they didn't have, big chunks of it. You had to open 40 little satchels to pour into your beer. So we were very fortunate to have gotten that. And I think a lot of brewers got their yeast from other brewers.
Oh, speaking of brewing, where did you learn how to brew barley wine?
Well, at Pike Place, when I got to Pike Place, they were making the two beers, and it became pretty obvious that people wanted more than just 2 or 3 beers. So we started to expand the types of beers that we made. And when I got on there, I was there for less than a year, maybe 6 to 9 months before the head brewer quit. And Charles Finkel said to me, "All right, you're up." So I was immediately in charge of, it's a small brewery, luckily. It wasn't that different. In fact, all breweries are pretty much like home brewing. It's just they got better equipment. So I quickly, had to learn a lot. So I did a lot of reading. And at some point, I went to Siebel in Chicago, Siebel Institute of Brewing. But we started developing new beers. We made one of the first IPAs that anybody had ever had. Not the first by any means. I think Big Time Brewing up the street was making an IPA. But, there weren't very many examples of a lot of beers. So you had to read about them and then kind of guess. Or if you were really lucky, you could get an imported one. But on the West Coast, any beer imported from Europe got shipped over to the East Coast. Not that bad of a trip. But then it had to get trucked across the country. And so the beer was often, aged. And if it was something like an IPA, the beer you got really wasn't the beer that the brewer had brewed. And the only people that were doing them were in England, and IPAs in England are really just a shadow of, their former self. They're actually less alcohol and less hoppy than, the ESBs or the bitters. So we had all these weird examples. So it was hard to know, and you just kind of had to guess at it. So we started brewing and made this beer, and I thought it was, it was a really nice beer. People liked it, got good reviews, and we sold that. I think they make a version of that beer. So then we had 3, and we kept adding. And one day, Charles said, "Well, let's make a barley wine." So we made a barley wine, and that was, I had to do a lot of research and reading on that. And that style had a little more literature out there. It was a little easier to research what to do. And that kind of led to talking to the people at Brewers Publication. And they said, well, you want to write a book about barley wine? And Dick Cantwell and I worked together at that time. And we'd always agree that if either of us got offered to write a book, we'd co-author it. So one day we got on an airplane and flew to London and drove around to every brewery that, you know, we could get a hold of that would let us come and visit that made a barley wine. And it was quite a fun trip. We went to Bass while they still were using their union system. We went down to Eldritch Pope, who makes Thomas Hardy. So we went to, you know, quite a few of the breweries around and Worthingtons and talked to them. And we kept running into people, as you do in the brewing industry. We started off at Bass, and they have a brewing kind of library museum thing there. And they were very kind. They opened up their books to us. And Bass number 1, which is their barley wine, I believe is the world's first trademark. So that was kind of cool to find out. And, you know, we got to look at their records and talk to them about, you know, their process. And we met a woman who ran a brewing library in London. So we got to go there and look around and read a lot of the books. I don't know if we'd ever found it any other way. It's not something that a lot of people know about. And she, you know, made some calls to other people. So we got connections kind of all along the way. It was fun.
That's great. What did you learn about barley wine in terms of the history of Europe?
Well, you know, barley wine is a relatively new thing as a concept. They used to brew, well, you know, everything was very different when you made beer back in the day. English brewing doesn't have a lot of records until relatively recently. So, but they would use a system called a partigile system, where they would mash the grain and then take the first runnings and then, you know, remash them and get second runnings. So the first runnings were called something like, you know, the premium, you know, and then it'd be like the second and then the third and then finally the table beer for the family, you know, for kids to drink. And so the kind of barley wine as a concept didn't really exist, but there was this, you know, this premium, the first runnings beer that was very strong. And so Bass started making a beer like that and marketing it as Bass number 1. And that was the first barley wine. And that wasn't that long ago, you know, and others imitated them and made these really strong alcoholic beers. But the British taxation system doesn't favor that kind of beer. So by the time we got to researching it, they didn't make Bass number 1 anymore. I think Worthington's Gold Shield and Thomas Hardy were the only 2 that were still being made. There were a couple others. But by and large, beers were lighter in alcohol because of taxation.
That's interesting. I remember talking to Mitch about early IPAs and learning about how they were aged in oak, and how a lot of early beers here in the US were pretty much just British styles carried over, and how there used to be a lot of IPAs before Prohibition, and then after that they kind of went away. So coming back to IPAs, how did you see those beer styles come about here in the US?
Well, again, you know, you had something, even if you were a German style brewing, you usually had something light, something dark, something wheat. And Germans got to make Pilsner and Dunkel or a Schwarzbier or something dark. And they had the addition of the wheat beer. And I think that craft brewers back in the 80s and 90s, they got into craft brewing because they didn't want, you know, something that looked like this. They didn't want yellow fizzy beer. Although that's what I want nowadays. And so they wanted other styles. They started asking for them, and it kind of started the proliferation of beer styles. And so brewers like myself looked at historical examples of things that we could brew, and there was a whole period of people expanding their portfolio with, traditional brewing styles. God forbid, porter, stout, imperial stout. And I think Americans in particular think bigger is better. And so they, started overdoing some of the things. So I think originally, for example, an IPA was pretty mid-range by today's standards, 7-8% beer. There were hops in it, but it probably wasn't nearly as bitter then as it is now. They were using flower hops. They didn't have extracts or pellets. You could only put so much flower hops in before you started losing so much liquid that it became a problem. And I mean, even in the early days of craft brewers making IPAs, your liquid losses would be tremendously high because you were using flower hops. They would soak up all this liquid, and those had to be separated, and the liquid went with them. So I think traditionally, they had more hops, but they didn't have these giant amounts, and hops were not of the same quality as they are today. So, they had minimal refrigeration. They had, they didn't pelletize. They were all flour. They had to be, put into bales, and the bales went into barns, and the barns were, not cooled. And so you either used them really quickly or they started to age. And, between one harvest and the next, the hops went from being really fresh and bright to kind of old and potentially moldy and, oxidized, cheesy hops. So I think, that things changed a lot during a year's period. And I think they didn't use a whole lot of the hops in IPAs like we do today because they just weren't, they were expensive and they weren't of the same quality.
One of the first beer events I went to in Seattle was a barley wine bacchanal, I think at Brewers.
Oh my.
I don't see those barley wine events a lot these days.
No, the Tornado down in San Francisco used to have an annual barley wine festival in February, and they would take out all their beer, all 50 plus taps, and put on 50 barley wines or 55 barley wines. And we used to go to that, and it was a sold out event, packed the whole time. And after a while, I got to, friends with the owner, Dave, and his bar manager at the time, Dave Serball. And I helped Dave a couple years do that changeover. So we'd go in at, like 1 a.m. and start taking kegs off, rinsing the lines and putting on, a barley wine there. And it was kind of fun to do because you were there from 1 a.m. until opening, but you got to try all the barley wines before anyone else. So as the evening progressed, you got, a little more tipsy. And then of course, about 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, you were pretty much done.
Ready for some breakfast, huh?
Yeah.
You're known for your sour beer production. Tell us more about your Gose and how that story came about.
Well, we didn't start out to make a Gose. Our lab guy, Andy Hooper, was he's also a brewer, and he went on to be head brewer at Seismic Brewing. Very smart guy. And he said to me one day, "Hey, I want to make a sour mash beer. Like they have sour mash whiskey. I want to make sour mash beer." And I tried that once or twice before, and it failed. And I said to him, "Sure, go ahead, do whatever." And he made this beer, and it sat for multiple days and, souring. And at the end, it was sour, but it was also terrible tasting. It was like gym locker meets gym socks. It was really sweaty and cheesy and terrible. And we actually ended up dumping the beer. And I said to him, "So Andy, what do you think went wrong?" And he said, I don't know, but I'm going to find out. And I thought, ooh, if Andy, who's a very smart guy, is going to find out, I better do some research so I can, discuss this with him intelligently. And a couple weeks later, we were sitting at our pub having a beer, discussing it, and my next door neighbor, Mike Luparello, who's also a former professional brewer but a great home brewer, he was kind of leaning over someone's shoulder listening, and at some point he said, "That sounds like a great way to make a Gose." And both Andy and I had never heard of this style Gose, and we said, "What?" And we did some research and thought, oh yeah, that does kind of sound like a good way to make a Gose, which is a sour, slightly salty or saline wheat beer. And you sour the wort in the brew house, not post brew house. So there are a lot of advantages to that. It's very quick if you do it right. It shouldn't take 3 days. It should really take like less than a day, really less than 12 hours. And you do it by adding lactic acid bacteria, to either the mash or the wort, and taking some precautions. And both Andy and I discovered one of the things that made that first batch smell so terrible was acetobacter and a few other things that are inherently in grain. And when you mash grain, one of the things you want is a little bit of air, bound up in the mixture, because it floats the whole bed of the mash in there. If you beat out all the air with a mixer, what you end up with is this thick pancake that you can't really run off. There's no, you don't get any liquid out the bottom. So in a normal mash, you want a little air in there. But if you're going to sour it, you don't want the air there, because air has oxygen, and oxygen feeds the acetobacter. Acetobacter it needs air in order to grow. So what Andy and I decided is that we would get the wort, the sugary liquid, off of the grain with all that air in it and over into the kettle. And then we would coat the top of the kettle with an inert gas, nitrogen or argon or something, and that would make a layer on top of the wort that excluded oxygen. And there is very little oxygen in the wort at that point. So acetobacter won't grow very fast, may start to, but by that time, the lactic acid bacteria, which is naturally occurring on the grain, starts to drop the pH. So you don't have oxygen, and then once the pH gets down around 4.5 or a little lower, that also excludes acetobacter and enterobacteria and some of these other weird things you don't want. And then you end up with a nice kind of tangy, low pH wort, and you can boil that to kill all the acid bacteria in there so you don't transfer it over into your brew house. And if you do it right, or if you add some additional lactic acid bacteria, your acid fermentation can be quite quick.
So there were 3 minds working on this beer, essentially, this Gose.
Oh yeah. So it's definitely not, I didn't, like people say, oh, you, whatever, introduced America to Gose. Well, I didn't do that. First of all, there were other people already making Goses in the US. I don't know who the first was, but, we'd gotten some samples to try before we brewed ours, so we had some sort of an idea, and they were still being made in Germany in a few places. So we weren't the first. I think we may have been one of the first, largely well-distributed breweries to make them and can them and bottle them. So we were the first kind of in that way. And then when we got well known for these beers, the Brewers Publication folks came and said, hey, you want to write a book? I said, I don't know. The other one was a lot of work. They said, we want you to write the book on Gose. And since I'd already started a bunch of the research, in order to make ours, I thought, sure, why not? I'll waste a year of my life writing a book.
Lots of people speak very highly of this Gose.
Well, that's nice to hear. We sell a lot of Gose now, and that's good. In some ways, I think it may have actually saved the brewery in a period where, our innovation was kind of taking a downward turn. Here's something new that brought a new life to the brewery. And, writing the book certainly didn't hurt any of that. It helped. And I did kind of the same process as we did with the barley wine book. I got on an airplane and flew to Germany and drove around all these places and met all these interesting people. And I was incredibly lucky. I kept meeting people along the way that would introduce me to, some other person that was making either a sour beer or, like a Berliner Weiss, or they'd introduce me to some brewer. And there's a little pub that I wanted to go to because were kind of like the home of the rebirth of Gose back in the 80s in Germany. It was called Ohne Bedenken. And I walked in, and it's very German there. And so I ordered a beer in German, I ordered dinner in German, and, was sitting by myself. But it was pretty obvious that German was not my first language. And some guy, older guy, walked up and said to me in English, "So, what do you think of that beer?" And I was kind of, stunned that he was speaking English, because we were on, it's kind of out there, this little pub. And I said, it's the whole reason I'm here. And I told him my story, and he said, "Oh, well, I'm the brewer here. Would you like to see our brewery?" And I didn't even know they had a brewery. So we went to see his little brewery that he had in the back. And then he took me the next day to meet other brewers in town that, were making Goses. So it was very fortuitous. It was a good trip.
And you also spent some time in Southeast Asia. Can you tell me more about that and what you learned there?
Yeah, it was a tremendous experience. I got a call from a woman who was heading a project for Asia Pacific Brewing, and they make Tiger beer mostly, although at the time I think they had 40 or so breweries around Asia. They were partially owned by Heineken. I think they're fully owned by Heineken now. They made Guinness and Heineken and some of their own brands like Tiger. And they wanted to get involved in craft brewing. And so they were looking for someone who had kind of an unusual set of qualifications. They wanted this person to design and oversee the installation of a brewery. And then they wanted them to design the recipes and brew the beers. And then they wanted them to be the face of the brewery to get out and market it. And I'd done all three of those things at different times in my career. So I won't say I was uniquely qualified, but it was, it's an unusual set of qualifications. So she convinced me that I should do this, and it's a good thing because they pay way better there than they did here. But I flew out to Singapore, and I was there for 5 years. My original contract was for 2 years, but I really enjoyed it there. And when I got there, the first meeting, it was all very different because it's very formal there. I had to wear like slacks and a collared shirt, and shoes. To all these meetings, I had to buy all these nice clothes. I didn't have to wear a tie, thank goodness, but they did expect me to wear like a dress shirt. And so the first meeting I go to, everyone's from somewhere else. There's a Chinese guy, an Australian guy, a French, a German. They're all speaking English, but they all have accents, and they're all pretty heavy accents. And so, the Malay guy is saying one thing, the Chinese, and about the time I get my ear tuned to someone's accent, someone else started talking. And I thought, my God, I'm never going to make it. And I was supposed to be in charge of this project. And so they'd be talking, and then, they'd pause and look at me, and I'd be like, oh yeah. Mm-hmm. I had no idea what they'd said. But I figured whatever it was, these guys were all, they were engineers and marketing people and all these different, and I figured they already knew what they were doing. And at the end of the meeting, I said to my boss, I said, I don't know, this is you guys don't even have a building to put this in. She's like, oh no, it'll be no problem. You'll take care of it. You'll be fine. So, I got there and there was just a big piece of grass that they were going to put a building in. So I had to oversee the building of the building, and it was just insane. It was nuts. But we had a lot of really good people who were very helpful. I learned a whole lot about building a building, and I learned all at every step. I learned more than I already knew. The guy we got to make the equipment had a factory in Hungary, and so I got to fly out and go to Hungary and inspect the equipment, and that was kind of an interesting piece. And then because Heineken was our technical supervisor, I worked with Heineken a lot and their folks, and that was very interesting, and I learned a lot. And I learned that in other countries, things can happen a lot quicker because that's how it is. They don't have the rules. So the entire building got built in less than 100 days. So it went from a green piece of grass to a fully erect building in like 98 days. And my blog has a related photo site that has a picture of, almost every day and watching the building, just kind of grow up out of the ground. And they worked on it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for those 98 days.
Coming back to Anderson Valley, after that time, were you intimidated or were you worried about filling those shoes, or did you feel confident about coming back?
I felt pretty confident after 5 years, overseas. It was a great experience in a lot of ways, but I think one of the other things it did was build a lot of confidence for me, because once you can master some of these really seemingly enormous problems, you come back here and these like, oh yeah, these are a lot simpler. Anderson Valley already had a brewery in a building, and some of the experience I got before going to Asia was helping build the buildings here and install equipment here. So I was already pretty familiar with Anderson Valley, and it wasn't quite so intimidating. One of the things that when I was in Singapore, their concept was to fuse Asian cooking tradition with European brewing tradition. And so I spent a lot of time seeking out unusual ingredients to put into beer and making some really unusual beers. It really kind of stretching, the envelope there. And ultimately, I think some of those beers were just too weird for people, but it's what they wanted, and so that's what I went out and did. And that experience, when I came back here, craft brewing was just taking off again. It had kind of this down period while I was in Asia, so that was also very lucky to not be here for that. And then coming back as the growth was starting up again, it was a very exciting time, and people were putting more of these unusual things into beers. So I'd already, gathered some experience and ideas on how to do that. So we immediately put those, skills or research into play here and started making some very unusual, and interesting beers. And we continue to do that. We just made an IPA for a chef friend of ours, Mark Dim, who owns an inn out on the coast here, and we've been making beer with him for 5 or 6 years. And we just made one the other day, and it's got Quattro Spice, which is a blend of spices, as well as candy cap mushrooms and pink peppercorns and a little bit of grapefruit rind. And so it's a very unusual IPA, dry hopped with some experimental hops. So hopefully that'll be packaged up by the end of this week and in his pub by next week. And it'll be fun. It's a very interesting beer, and it's the only place you're going to be able to get it on the planet is at his pub, which I think is kind of cool.
Yummy. That sounds good. Is it just a one-off beer, or do you think he will continue to brew it?
Well, we have made 4 different versions of a saison for him that was in a similar kind of vein with similar ingredients, not all the same, but similar. I think candy cap mushrooms were in all of those beers. And the saisons they sold really well in the beginning, but I think that style has kind of tapered off some. So we tried something different this year. So it's a one-off, as all of them were, but we will do something similar, I think, again next year.
That's great. Yeah, that kind of answers my next question, which is how do you stay inspired and come up with new ideas for beer styles and flavor profiles?
I don't know. I really like beer, so that helps me stay, connected and entertained. A few years ago, I was at the GABF judging beer, and I judged a couple styles of things that I hadn't, made myself. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. There's some styles out there which I've never made, and I'm getting along in my career, and maybe I want to do these now. So I picked 7 beer styles, historic beer styles that I'd never made, that I thought, that'd be kind of cool. So I came back and over the next few years made each one of those, and that was tremendously fun and inspiring. And I learned a lot. You think you know something about something, and then you learn some new stuff. You're like, wow, how did I miss that all those years? Lars Gospel, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. Very interesting guy, has a blog site about beer, and he helped me do some research for the Gose book. So I knew Lars, and he's into this Scandinavian farmhouse brewing, which is really, really cool. And he wrote a book on it. It's somewhere on my bookshelf. Great book. Everyone should own it. Anybody who's interested in brewing anyway. But he helped me kind of do some research, and that book gave me some ideas. And so kind of the last beer that we brewed of those 7 historic styles was a Sati. And we did it as traditionally as we could. So I went out and sourced river rock from the back of our property, and found out which ones could stand being heated up and which ones couldn't. And then I built a thing to where wood went in the bottom and all the rocks were piled up on the top. So we got oak from our property and heated up the rocks from the property until they were red hot, and then we mashed in with cool water or tepid water, and then dropped in the hot rocks to heat up the mash to convert the sugar. And we didn't boil, so at the end we just ran off. We brought it up to, by putting hot rocks into the mash, we heated it up enough to get pasteurization, and then we ran off into wooden barrels and pitched in a Kvike yeast and just let it go. So like the Scandinavian breweries, they use those yeast rings or wands or whatever. We figured pitching would be okay, but we did it all in wood, all without no attemperation, so the beer got as warm as it was going to get and cooled down and however it got. And the whole dang thing was done in barrels, no boil, so raw beer, no boiling of hops. We threw some hops into the mash, and then we carbonated it, and it was really quite interesting beer and actually sold well.
Wow, I'd like to try that.
It was a fun beer to make. I'd like to do it again, although it is a lot of work. I had to recruit people to help me do it, to heat up the rocks and drop them into the mash, and someone has to stir because the rocks are a couple thousand degrees, and there's some scorching that takes place, which kind of brings an interesting flavor to the beer. But you really do have to keep stirring, otherwise you just have pockets of hot and the rest of the work doesn't get cool, it doesn't get warm. So someone has to be stirring, and someone has to be picking the hot rocks out of the the giant thing. And we had to make this kind of claw apparatus to pick the rocks up with and dump them into the wort. So there's a lot of fun kind of stuff like that.
Did you also roast your own malts?
No, we thought about doing stuff like that, but some of this stuff is like one of the beers we made in that historic series was the Polish smoked beer.
Oh, the Grodziki?
Yeah, Grodzicki. I don't know. I'm not Polish. But we had some Polish guy come and say how to pronounce it, and I was like, oh wow, I don't know if I'm going to get that, but I think it's Grodzicki. And at first I was going to smoke all the malt myself over oak from the property, and I've been harvesting the oak and putting it aside. And then one of our guys who does the malt order says, you know, Weirman makes an oak smoked wheat malt just for those kind of beers. And I was like, oh, well, let's order some of that, because that's going to be way easier. So we made one of those, and I don't know. Smoked beer is an acquired taste, and it's not very popular. So it's taken us a long time to sell all those kegs. I like it, but most people are like, nah.
So it seems like people are adventurous, and maybe they would be open to enjoying some of these beers if they were able to learn more about them.
Yeah, I think education is a big part. You have to give people some sort of expectation of what they're going to get. I think that's really helpful. So those kinds of beers, you really need to talk about them, and it's hard to get in front of consumers a lot. And when there were, 100 or even 1,000 breweries in America, you saw a lot more education. I think Pete Schlossberg of Pete's Wicked Ale did a tremendous job educating distributors and consumers alike, and I think all craft brewing owes him a debt for that. And people were into it, but nowadays people are less into it because it's just, there's craft beer everywhere. I'm not really sure why they aren't more receptive to those sorts of things, but when we've done them in the recent past, they just haven't been as well attended. You need some other kind of hook. You can't just say, I'm going to talk about beer. Right. You need something more for the consumer nowadays, because people didn't know a lot about beer then. Nowadays you just sign on to the internet and learn about all kinds of things. Sadly, a lot of what you're going to learn isn't true. So that's a problem. I read an article today, and these people were claiming to be the first brewery who had like tank service, like beer coming directly from tanks to the bar. And I thought, that's absurd. There were breweries in Denver doing that 20 years ago or more. Pike Place did it when they built their new brewery back in the 90s. So these people now claiming that they're the first to do it, it's just like, really? You guys didn't do a lot of research, did you? So some of the stuff you read is just not true.
The consumer reflects what the beer industry is into, and a lot of brewers, they're wanting to brew things that they think people are going to buy. Then there's less of that creativity and ingenuity.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with creativity, and I applaud it. And sometimes you're going to make things that people love, and sometimes you're going to make things like Grodzicki, which nobody loves except for like a handful of people. And I think it's good to have some of both at your tap room. It's good to have a nice wide portfolio, but I think sometimes people get carried away. Some of the things that I get now, I scratch my head about. And we did a collab with this brewery. I'm just going to say a brewery, and they're really well known for making very interesting beers and very good beers. And we made a great collab with them, but they sent us a couple cans afterwards. And one of them, I'm reading the description, it goes into the can at 24 degrees or 22 degrees Plato, which is, that's where barley wine starts. So they're brewing a beer, and then they're putting so much fruit in it that it raises the sugar content to, 22 degrees Plato. And you have to keep it refrigerated, because if you don't, stuff's going to start growing in there and the cans will explode. I'm like, okay, I'm all for innovation, but this is a little crazy. Exploding cans? I mean, you're going to get sued eventually. And I don't know if they still do it. And they sold a lot of it. It was very popular, whatever they were doing. People, you know, were standing in line to get this beer that was so sweet. It was sweeter than, you know, like fruit juice. And I just don't get it. I mean, I'm not even sure you'd be able to call that beer at that point. It's alcoholic fruit juice. And if that's what you think, fine. But is it beer? I don't know. It's not this kind of beer.
Do you have any advice for new brewers?
Yeah, finish your law degree. Yeah, brewing is really, really tough right now. And I think, honestly, my advice to anybody at this point is to just wait. You know, if you're really interested, if you really have your heart set on it, fine. Buy some used equipment now, because there's more and more of it becoming available as people fail. And, you know, the failures are not necessarily the smaller breweries. In fact, those are probably ones failing less. It's the mid-sized breweries. I mean, the guys who make Racer 5 just went out of business, you know? So they were a big brewery. And Anchor, you know, went out of business. So it's really, if Anchor can't make it, how are you going to survive out there? So if you're planning to make a distribution brewery, I would just say don't. Go back to school, get whatever degree you need, do something else. A better investment in your money is, you know, buy a 6-pack. And if you have your heart set on it, do something small. But the problem with doing a small brewery is that you then have to have food. And if you don't have food, it's hard to survive. It's hard to keep people at your place without some sort of food. So some folks are opening small breweries and then working with food trucks, you know, local food trucks, to supply the food for them. And that's a great way to do it if you can, if there are enough food trucks or if there's people who are interested. It's a nice partnership. But without food, you're going to have a hard time getting the volume of sales you need. And if you do have food, now you're running a whole different business. Now you're running a restaurant. And we all know that that's a really tough business, and the majority of restaurants don't make it more than 2 years. So you're kind of handicapping yourself by running a restaurant and a brewery. But if you don't have the food, then, you know, you're going to have a hard time. So you don't want to run a regional brewery. Nobody wants to run a national brewery. If you're a small brewery, you got to have food. So it's tough now. And there's 10,000 breweries in America. That means there's, I don't know, every town has one pretty much.
And the quality is definitely gotten better, probably, right?
I think so. I think you run into a lot of, you know, if this is the mediocre level, I think you run into a lot of breweries who are, you know, somewhere above that. They're not mediocre, but they're not great. There are not a lot of great breweries out there. And there are enough of them that now, you know, just making good beer isn't enough. You have to have other things going on for you. But there are a lot of breweries. You go into some of these pubs, you know, brew pubs, and you have their beer, and you have 4 or 5 of the beers, and they all kind of taste the same, even though they look different. And you think, well, they weren't bad beers, but they really didn't have a lot of differentiation in their lineup. And so, are they bad brewers? No, but they're not great brewers. You know, they're okay. And I think there's a lot of that out there. And some of those folks have good locations, good food, and they survive. And that's great. But I think more and more you're going to see places like that don't really have excellent products, you know, go by the wayside.
Right, yeah, it just takes another brewery to come in and do it better than they do for them to be in trouble.
Yeah, just down the street.
Speaking of Anderson Valley, next year you guys have a legendary festival, and it's been going over 20 years now, hasn't it?
I think this will be 26 years, yeah. Wow. May 4th coming up.
Very exciting.
Yep, we get about 85 breweries to come out, and pour 2 or more beers. So there's probably 200, 250 beers to try. Our state's more liberal than some, so there's no limit to the number you can try. We give you a glass and you just go around, they fill it up, and they don't put in just like an ounce or 2 ounces. They give you, a fairly decent sample size, and it's been very popular. I think at the peak we had about 5,000 people come to the Beerfest, and about 1,000 people came associated with the breweries. So we raised our town's population from about 800 people to, almost 7,000.
Wow. That's quite
for
an
2 nights.
Economic impact.
Yeah, and all the money goes to charity. I think we've raised over $1 million in the last 25 years or so for local charities. So all the money goes out to the charities, and it's a really fun event. There's a lot of camping. The fairgrounds is where the event is, and they also camp about 3,000 people there. So that becomes a party of its own before, during, and after the Beerfest. So it's really quite the event.
That sounds great. I was telling Mitch about that, and Mitch Steele, he says, I've never been to that. I need to go to that event.
Yeah, I've never seen Mitch here. Although, cover one eye to remember who I did see and didn't see.
Maybe we can get him out here this year.
Yeah, you guys should come down.
We'll work on that.
It's really a fun event. And it's on May 4th. Each year they have a theme. I'm not in favor of these themes all that much, but people seem to like them. So this year is on May 4th. So obviously it's Star Wars. May the 4th be with you.
Very cool. So will all the beers be, are there themed beers in the names or styles?
Sometimes people make themed beers. A lot of people dress up in costume. I've been convinced to dress up in costume a few times. So I think when we did Mardi Gras, it was a little easier for me. I'm not going to dress up like a medieval knight. I'm not just down.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to coming out for that, Val. Any last words you'd like to share with the community?
I just feel very honored and happy to have been part of brewing for so many years, and I encourage everybody to come up and visit and try some of our beers, or come to the beer festival. If they're coming through, stop and say hi. There are a lot of good breweries around. Fort Bragg, which is kind of a destination out on the coast, they now have 3 breweries in their little town. So you could do a real brewery tour, come up, stop at Russian River, go a little further, stop at a couple other breweries, then, come to Anderson Valley, and then go out to the coast and stop at the, 5 or 6 breweries out on the coast.
Absolutely. In Northern California, it's beautiful all year round.
Yep, it certainly is.
Wonderful, Val. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It was wonderful to learn about your history in beer, and more about the story of the Gose and about barley wine. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been fun talking to you, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Cheers. Yeah, you can
Cheers.
see them on May 4th. Cheers.
May 4th.